Roderick Wilde was the kind of man who had been invisible his entire life. From a penniless upbringing in the dreary town of Hightown, he was always the odd man out. His stilted social skills and lack of social wealth set him apart from his peers, a status quo that perpetuated into his adulthood. His entire life was a symphony of silence, orchestrated by the haunting aria of loneliness. Over time, Roderick began to retreat into the hollow shell of his dilapidated house, drawing the curtains of his existence against the world. His room became his sanctuary and his prison. The paint peeling off the walls mirrored his decaying sanity. The cracks running across the ceiling reflected the fractures within his psyche. Days turned into nights, and weeks into months, as he isolated himself from the world. The deprivation of human interaction started gnawing at his sanity, like a relentless beast feasting on his mind's coherence. His only solace lay at the bottom of whiskey bottles and in the wisps of smoke curling up from the countless cigarettes he consumed. His bloodshot eyes, gaunt cheeks, and the permanent sheen of sweat on his forehead painted the picture of a man grappling with the colossal weight of his own thoughts. The perpetual silence began to whisper menacing tales into his ears, and the isolation began to contort his perceptions. Roderick was spiraling down the abyss of his own madness, his loneliness amplifying every sordid thought, every suppressed anger. His isolation had crafted a lethal concoction of frustration, resentment, and rage, which slowly festered within him, unhindered and unrestrained. And one fateful day, the raging tempest within him finally broke free. Roderick's gaze fell upon a dusty kitchen knife lying at the corner of his table. The gleaming blade seemed to reflect his darkest intentions back at him. He grabbed the knife, its cold touch seeming to steel his resolve. The last semblance of sanity seemed to have deserted him, replaced by an inexplicable fury towards the world that had abandoned him. He stepped out of his room, the outside world seeming alien and hostile after his prolonged isolation. His car, a rickety old sedan, carried him through the grimly silent streets of Hightown. His destination? The home of a friend from the past, Aaron, one of the few who occasionally acknowledged Roderick's existence. As he parked his car in front of Aaron's house, a wave of déjà vu washed over him. The facade of the house seemed to mock his destitution and loneliness, amplifying his simmering rage. Aaron opened the door, his face registering shock and confusion at the sight of the disheveled man on his doorstep. Without uttering a word, Roderick lunged at him, his hands wielding the kitchen knife with an uncanny precision. In the ensuing struggle, Roderick's suppressed fury found a brutal outlet. The knife traced a bloody path across Aaron's body until he lay lifeless on his own living room floor. Panting heavily, Roderick dropped the knife, his hands and clothes smeared with the blood of his once friend. Roderick, his act of vengeance complete, sat in silence, staring at the carnage he'd wrought. The adrenaline faded, replaced by an eerie calm. He dialed 911 and reported his own crime. When the police arrived, they found him seated on the porch, his hands still crimson, his face devoid of emotion. Under questioning, Roderick's chilling confession shook everyone. His words echoed through the station. "I did it because I was angry at the world." The perplexed investigators tried to understand Roderick's psyche. The man sitting in front of them was far from the typical criminal archetype they often encountered. He was an emblem of extreme loneliness, a symbol of deep-rooted resentment, a product of chronic isolation, and a case study for the devastating impacts of extreme social isolation on the human psyche. Dr. Margaret Ross, a renowned forensic psychologist, was called in to dissect the twisted labyrinth of Roderick's mind. His case intrigued her, presenting a potent illustration of the devastating effects of prolonged loneliness and isolation. She began her sessions with Roderick, hoping to decipher the cryptic patterns of his behavior and potentially understand the mechanisms behind his tragic metamorphosis. During the initial few sessions, Roderick was reticent, his words scarce and clipped. However, as the weeks passed, he began to unravel. He spoke of his incessant loneliness, his crippling despair, his unfathomable anger. He described his room as a shadowy cave where he'd spent countless hours dwelling on his isolation. His voice echoed with raw emotion as he recounted the incessant heartache of his solitude and the rage that had resulted from it. As Margaret delved deeper into Roderick's psyche, she began to identify signs of an extreme form of schizophrenia, induced and exacerbated by his chronic isolation. Roderick was not just a cold-blooded murderer, he was a victim too. A victim of an uncaring society that let him slip through its cracks, and a mental health system that failed to recognize and address his deteriorating condition. Roderick's trial was a grim spectacle. As the details of his life were laid bare, a wave of sympathy swept over the courtroom. While his crime was horrific, the circumstances leading to his tragic descent invoked pity more than anger. The jury was torn, grappling with the notion of assigning blame to a man so evidently consumed by his mental illness. In the end, Roderick was deemed not guilty by reason of insanity. His lonely room exchanged for a lonely cell within a psychiatric facility. The world that had once neglected him was now forced to bear witness to his chilling tale, a tale of how isolation can ravage a mind, transforming a victim into a perpetrator. Roderick Wilde's tragic story serves as a stark reminder of the harrowing impacts of loneliness and isolation on mental health. It underscores the urgent need for societal compassion and an improved mental health care system capable of reaching those on the fringes, those who, like Roderick, are pushed into the terrifying chasms of their own minds. When you subscribe, be sure to hit the notification bell. Click here for more true scary stories.